Blender version 3.3 just released, and with it a new hair system. In this video, you're going to learn exactly how to create awesome hairstyles for your characters with this new system, whether it's for still renders, games, or animations. First of all, you need an object, a surface object that you want to apply the curves to. Make sure that you select the object that you want to apply the curves to, Shift A into curves, and then we can see empty here. This way you can make sure that the curves are immediately tied to the surface that you want to attach them to. Now with this new curve object, we can go and select it, and then we can go into the sculpt mode, which gives you a whole new slew of tools that we can use now. All of these brushes have two modes that you can switch between. We have sphere and we have projected. Sphere basically lets you walk a little bit more locally, and it respects the 3D part of the, viewport, whereas projected doesn't really care about the 3D aspect. The first brush, the add brush, lets you add new hair to the surface. If you want to increase the frequency, you can go to the brush settings here and then go to stroke, and you can increase the spacing here. For example, if I set it to 1%, then I'm going to add more hair than I did previously. If you want to increase the amount of hair that you apply with every brush stroke, you can increase that here. For example, if I set that to 10, you can see now I add 10 hairs to the surface at the same time. And then of course we can also change the shape of the hair, the curve shape. We can change the length of the hair, and then we can also change the points of the hair. The more points you have, the more control you can have over the shape of your hair strands. One thing that we can see immediately is that the hair looks very blocky, doesn't really look as smooth as it probably should. In the render settings, there's the curve setting. You have to open this little viewport display setting here, and then we can change, first of all, the way we can see the hair. I would recommend using strips. This way you can immediately see what the shape of the hair actually looks like and how thick it is. And then you can also increase the additional subdivisions in the viewport. I usually set that to 3. I guess that kind of depends on how strong your PC is and how much, your PC can handle in terms of hair. Of course, we can not only change the curve shape manually, kind of defining it beforehand, but we can also use the interpolation settings. Interpolation basically means the closer you create a new hair next to another hair, the more it will copy that hair's shape and whatever you determine in the interpolation settings. If you hold left click, the interpolation works very well, but if you don't hold and you just click, you can see the interpolation kind of always works with what is already there, which means that because you started from the right side, the interpolation kind of sways over to the right side rather than looking at both sides equally. The next setting that we have here is the delete setting. With the delete setting, pretty simple. We can just, remove hair. The density brush lets you control the density of hairs. So basically how close the hairs are allowed to be to create an even sort of distribution of hair. We can basically make it so that the brush only adds more hair if there's not enough density, or it can remove hair if there's too much density, or you can make it so that it automatically determines whether there needs to be hair removed or there needs to be hair added to the surface. You can define how dense the hair can be by pressing Shift R, and then you can see you get this sort of grid that basically shows you how close the hair can be. So if you set it to something like this, and then we use it, you can see they all are evenly distributed. The distance between them always stays the same. Instead of clicking Shift R, we can also go to the setting here, left clicking it, and then we can exactly do the same as we did before. And with the count max, I think we can sort of determine how often the brush changes or adjusts the density in a certain area that it currently is applied to. One thing to note though is if you set a different curve shape here in the add brush, and then you go over to the density brush, you can see that we have to change the settings here as well. You would either have to, copy the settings that you had in the add brush, or you can use, interpolation here if you want. The next brush is the comb brush. The comb brush is basically the main brush that you use to shape the hair. You can use it to, move it in different directions, create different, for example, strands here, kind of bring it together, clump it together, create certain flows and whatever you want to do with it. The snake hook brush basically enables you to kind of create a new shape for the hair, but also extends the hair following the brush. One thing to note for this is that it doesn't increase the amount of points that you have for every curve. The longer the hair of course gets, the less control or the stiffer the hair gets, because you have less control points that you can change to define the shape of the hair. The grow and shrink brush basically lets you grow and shrink the hair by just applying the brush, either adding or removing as the primary function, and then holding control does the exact opposite. Of course, you can also change the strength of the brush by pressing Shift and F. And if you want to change the radius of the brush, you can press F. And that, of course, is the same for all brushes. The next brush that we have is the pinch brush. The pinch brush basically lets you pinch hair together. It basically pulls all the hair in the affected radius together into the middle of the brush. The puff brush brings the hair back to its original shape. The smooth brush also smooths the hair, but this brush cares more about making the curve actually straight rather than bringing the curve back to its original sort of direction. And the slide brush basically enables you to move hair along the surface into different directions. This way you can, for example, kind of spread out the hair a little bit more if you want to, or you can kind of control where they originate from. You can bring them closer together. And the last tool, probably one of the most important tools, is the selection paint brush. The selection paint brush basically enables you to select individual hair strands so that you can work on, individual hair strands rather than the entire hair. The point mode basically enables you to select individual points of the curve, or you can also change it to the curve mode. This way you can select the whole curve rather than only selecting one point. By just left clicking, you see you lose the previous selection, but if you hold Shift, you can add more curves to your current selection. And if you hold Control, you can remove them again. I like to use a constant fall off just because then I can make sure that all the hairs are 100% selected. If you have a certain fall off in here, you can see you kind of create a gradient of selection, which means that the curves that you selected sort of halfway or at the border are less affected by the changes that you want to apply than the ones that are fully selected. Instead of using the selection paint brush, you can also select individual parts of the curves over here in the select settings. We can of course select everything, nothing, the opposite of what you have currently selected. You can select random curves, the endpoints of all the curves, and you can, grow and shrink the selection. You can either press here or you can press Shift A to select more and more of the curve. And if you, for example, realize that you still want to change the shape of the actual object that you apply the curves to, you can see now the curves are not really attached to the surface anymore. You can fix that though, going into scope mode, and then you can say curves snap to deform surface. Deform surface basically means that the curves get snapped to the exact point on the surface that they were on before, and nearer surface basically means that they get snapped to the surface that they are closest to. Of course, the old particle system also still exists. If you want to move the hair from your new system to the old system, you can do that as well by going here to the curve setting and then convert to particle system. Now we've basically copied these curves to the sphere and created a particle system on that sphere. We can go to the particle settings and we can see here we have these curves. We can also now bring the particle hair system over to the new curve system. We select these triangle or this V, and then we can say convert to curves. This way you create a new curves object, but right now the curves are not connected to any surface. The way we can fix that is if we go in here, we can say surface, we select this object, we can maybe change the shape, but we, for example, cannot use the slide tool. You can see here we get this missing surface mesh problem. If you go to the object that is the surface object, we can go into the UV maps setting here and we can see the active UV map. Usually the UV map is just called UV map. So if we now tap that into the UV map, you cannot move it around still because we now need to say curve, snap to nearest surface or deform surface. I think nearest surface would be applicable here. And if we do that, they might change a little bit in terms of their position, but then we can move them around again. One thing to note is if you go into scope mode and you add hair or you kind of do anything with your hair and it gets very laggy, that is most likely because of the amount of resolution that the surface geometry has. So for example, if I go to this character here and I change the multi-resolution modifier, I disable it, and then I go back into the scope mode, you can see it gets way smoother. We can now, just go in here and use the brush to add more hair to the surface here. And then we can use the comb brush, maybe even use projected to move all of the hair, for example, back to create the most basic hairstyle like this. I usually work in layers. That means creating a layer that creates the volume of the hair, then creating another layer on top of that that sort of adds more texture, more depth into the hair, and then maybe one more for some details, for example. And for very specific hairstyles, for example, like dreadlocks, it's probably easier to first create a geometry node setup to create the dreadlocks instead of having to kind of create them by just brushing them around. So whether you start with geometry nodes, whether you can just create the basic hairstyle, or you want to create a more layered hairstyle, a more complex hairstyle, always depends on, the hairstyle that you want to create. For every hairstyle, you have 3 different layers that you kind of have to keep in mind. And the longer the hair is, the more that kind of plays a role. So we have, the main hair flow like this, just kind of following the biggest shape of the hair, seeing in which direction the hair falls. The next step is to separate the big flow into individual hair strands that kind of follow their own direction, but still follow the main flow. This one has its own sort of shape, this one as well. In this way, you can see you can create this layering, which adds more depth to the hairstyle and also makes it look more interesting. You might have, you know, these two layers, but then they can still look very perfect and not really that realistic. And that is because we always have individual hair strands that don't really follow any of the hair flow at all, or just kind of very briefly. This strand here in the front that just kind of goes down like this. We can see one right here, and these hairs really help make the hairstyle look more realistic and more natural. You can especially see it here, these floating hairs here all around. These ones are very, very useful to make a hairstyle look more realistic. What I usually like to do first is I like to define the shape of the hair. So once I've added a few curves to the surface, I like to go here into the geometry node editor. And then I like to go into the rendered view, because this, you know, shows you what the hair in the end will actually look like. Here are the most basic settings that I use to define the curve. The most important thing, of course, as we can see, the curves are way too thick right now. We can change that by, for example, going in here, going into the curve settings, and then we can say set curve radius. So if I, for example, now divide this by 2, you can see it's half as thick. You can make it even slimmer. If you, for example, want to make the root thicker than the tip, the way you can do that is you can go in here and you can use another curve node, which is the spline parameter. The factor of this node basically creates a value from 0 to 1, starting from the root to the tip. The length basically is a value for the length of the actual hair curve. So the longer it is, the longer the value is. And then of course we have the index, basically the individual ID or unique number for each individual hair curve. But if I now just plug the factor into the radius, you can see everything looks super weird because the values of the factor are way too big. The way we can change that is by going in here and adding a math node, plugging that in, and then we need to switch it to multiply, and for example multiply it by 0.01, and we can see we get closer and closer to the value that we actually want. That looks pretty good. Now we can see that the root is narrower than the tip. The way we can change that is we can use another curve node, which is the curve reverse curve. This basically just changes the direction of the curve. Now the tips are thin and the roots are thick. Another node that can be very useful, of course, is the trim curve node. This one basically lets you shorten the curve. If we would bring this trim curve, for example, in front of the reverse curve, you can see if I reduce the end now, you can see I reduce it from the tip. So this way you could, for example, shorten the curve, or you can add some variation to how long the curves actually are. Very useful, for example, if you want to make the hair even more realistic. Other ones that can be very useful are the curve to mesh node. This one basically turns the curve into a mesh, but this one requires a profile curve to actually convert it into a mesh. You can now just go into curve primitives. We can say, hey, we use a curve circle, and then if we plug the curve circle into the profile curve, we can see now we can actually see the hair again, but now it's not just a curve, but it's actually geometry. So for example, you can create a custom profile curve and then create sort of a stylized hairstyle with that. So this is basically the basic setup to create or define the shape of the curve. We can now change the thickness of the hair, and we can also change the length of the hair or add some variation. And now of course what we need is a material. To add a material, we can just go in here and we can say material, set material, plug that in there. So if you now go to the shader editor and we create a hair shader, what I like to use is the shader principled hair BSDF. Of course, we now have created the hair shader, but we still need to define it in the geometry nodes. We can see that we need to select it here. So we select hair right there. And now these hair strands have the hair material applied to them. So now we can change the material, and we can define the material, and we can also define the shape to create the most basic setup for our hair system. Now that the hair strands are defined, we can go and start creating the hairstyle. The way I like to start is by starting from the back of the head and then working my way from the bottom to the top into the middle and the front of the head. The reason why I do that is usually hairstyles are kind of combed backwards to the back of the head. What happens is that you cannot really sort of select the hairs that are at the back of the head because they're sort of underneath the layer that is coming from the front of the hair. And if you want to adjust the back hair, that gets kind of fiddly and very hard to do, even with the select tool. As you can also see, I like to block out my hair first by creating a sculpt. Then I don't have to worry about the main shape and kind of thinking about the main shape when I actually create the hairstyle. I create the sculpt first so that I have a really great guide to follow to create the actual hair strands. So I don't only really have to worry about combing the hairs into the right direction and into the right, position. I can kind of take some of that load that you have to kind of think about when you create the hairstyle away. So I always, enable and disable the sculpt hairstyle, the block out, so I can see if I'm still in the shape that I want to kind of create here. And I just kind of use a mix between the ant brush, the comb brush, switching between projected and spherical to shape the hairstyle, the most broad hairstyle. This one, of course, in the beginning is only layer 1, the volume and main flow shape. So I don't really fully focus on adding a lot of detail to the hair because we're going to add the second layer on top of this one. So this one isn't as visible. It is mostly there to fill the volume of the hair so that you cannot see the skin underneath the hair and the hair looks as dense as it needs to be. I also separate the hairstyle into multiple curved parts or into multiple curved objects because then I can have more control and it is easier to work with the entire hairstyle. Separating the parts into different objects can help you really make the workflow way easier. Now we go from big strands to a little smaller strands. The second layer, what I do is I like to sort of draw these individual islands of strands, mask them, and then I like to sort of, shape them and lay them on top of the volume layer to create more depth in the hair and also kind of break up the main flow so that it isn't like all going in the same direction. This way you can create a sort of randomness that helps make the hairstyle more intriguing and more interesting, and it also helps in making it look more realistic. What I like to do is I like to go to the viewport shading and then enable the color random setting. This way all the different curve objects have different colors and you can see way easier which hair curve object is which one. The second layer is also great to now lay out the hairline. The hairline needs quite a lot of hair to be very exact. Now with these strands we can create a denser hairline basically that can help us, just kind of make the hairline, more solid. And now all that's left is to add some randomness into it, basically adding some individual strands or even individual hairs that maybe sometimes follow the flow, maybe sometimes they don't, maybe sometimes they just fall in front of the face, just to kind of bring a little bit of randomness into the entire thing and make the whole thing feel alive. What I like to do here is I like to add just a few individual hair strands around the sort of hairline to make sure that the hairline isn't as fully 100% clean. There is some randomness to it. Then I also added the bun. The bun I just created the same way that I've created the rest of the hair, adding the first layer. I also actually used the interpolation to create the ring, the bun, very quickly. And then I just created the other two layers, by copying the first one and kind of adjusting the copy to make it look more like the other two layers. Another thing that I've done for the bun is I have changed the geometry nodes just so that the thickness doesn't change. I've basically created a copy and then just removed the spline thickness and adjusted it so that the strands are as thick as the other ones, so that I don't lose any thickness in the middle of the bun. And then to finish it off completely, what I've done is I've duplicated the layers of hair that basically cover the hair currently, basically layer 2. And then I went in and used the random selection to remove random hair 4 times, I think. And then I brought it up just a little higher than the actual hair, sort of body of hair, to create these floaters that are all over the hair, to add even more randomness, make it look even more alive and even more realistic. Of course, especially for hair, you can work on it as long as you want. You can add as much detail as you want, but at least these 3 layers you kind of need to make it look, in my opinion, realistic. When it comes to the eyebrows, I like to actually utilize the interpolation function. I like to create the flow of the hair first. That's sort of what the flow looks like, kind of the hairs going into the middle and then kind of trailing off at the end. I like to create a few hairs first, and then I like to use the interpolation function to fill the eyebrows slowly but surely until I, especially in render view, see that it's, thick enough. For the eyelashes, I do something very similar. I like to create just a few eyelashes first and then shape them into what I think they should look like. And then I like to use the interpolation function once again to create more more hairs. They might kind of veer off of where I want to have them. So I like to use the mask brush, for example, to bring them a little bit closer into the rest of the eyelashes or into the shape that I want them to be. One thing to note for the eyelashes actually is that the middle, like looking from the inner eye to the outer eye, the middle of the eyelid is basically where the eyelashes are the longest. It maybe seems like that the eyelashes are the longest at the outer side, but that is actually not true. It is actually in the middle. Of course, I do the same for the lower eyelashes as well, but of course there are a few less than at the top. And after the hair is fully modeled, it is time to create the shader. For the shader, as I said before, you can begin with a principled hair BSDF. I would basically always recommend to add a little bit of variation into the hair. The way you can do that is with the curves info node. The curves info node has different values that you can use. It basically taps into different values of the curves. You can look at the length and kind of take the length and create like colored strands so that the end of the strands are colored in different colors than, for example, the top. And I would recommend basically always using the random value because it can give you just a slight variation in the coloring of your hair. So even if you just want to use a solid color, you can then go ahead and create a mix RGB node and then plug the randomness, for example, into the lower value or into the lower color, and then you can set it to multiply. This way you can make a few of these strands just a little bit darker than the other strands, just to add just a very slight variation into the hair, which I think helps with the realism as well. But one thing to note is that, for example, for the length where you can kind of create these colored tips, it always takes the length that the hair actually has into consideration. So if there's longer hair and then there's shorter hair, the shorter hair has the same sort of gradient as the longer hair. So that's why I didn't color the hair this way for this character. I actually created like a gradient that is tied to an object so that I can fully determine where the gradient is supposed to start. Otherwise, it wouldn't really have worked the way that I wanted it to. Of course, if you want to give different strands different materials, then you would have to, first of all, create the second material, but then also keep in mind that you need to change the material, not only in the material settings, but also in the geometry nodes. You need to relink the new material so that the material is actually, applied to the strands that they're supposed to be applied to. And of course, if you're using Eevee to render your scenes or just, to look at your character, you cannot use the principled hair BSDF node. So what you can also use is just take a principled BSDF node, like a standard BSDF node. This is what I maybe would use. You don't necessarily need subsurface scattering, but I think it helps a little bit. So if you want to use Eevee, you can, for example, use this material. The other coloring settings you can just copy basically. But now you might ask, well, I don't want to create characters with actually curved hair. I want to create video game characters. How do I do that? Well, let me tell you, that is possible as well. Big thanks to my good friend, Joey Carlino. He helped me a lot. He just did everything for me and just gave me the thing. So big thank you to him. If you want to check out this channel, then I'm going to put a link in the description. And he showed me how you can create hair cards in geometry nodes. I don't want to explain every single node. We can maybe get into that if you really want that, okay? Kind of going more deeper into the geometry aspect of these nodes. We can see here, it basically turns the curve into a plane, and then it takes the length and thickness of that plane for the X and Y value of the texture, which means that now you basically grab the length of the curve right here, and you grab the width of the curve, and you plug it into the group output. Then you have to go into the modifier settings of the geometry nodes modifier, and you have to actually name these settings. These ones will probably not call, these ones are probably just going to be called attribute. When you go into the group output, you can actually call them something different in here if you want to. If you press N, you can open this. Then you need to go into the modifier settings. You can, give them the same name or whatever you want to call it. And then you need to go into the shader editor because we need to create a shader to apply the hair card. The way we do that is pretty simple. You can use an attribute node, and then you basically access the length and also the width of the geometry nodes. You combine the X and Y and Z. You can also do that in the geometry nodes, but for cycles, for some reason that doesn't work. You have to use the shader combine XYZ for that. And then you can just use a mapping node to map the hair onto these XYZ, and then you can run that through a principled BSDF, and then you have hair cards for instead of the curves. And if you see that the hair is actually flipped, the way we can fix that is we can just go in here and we can change the mapping, for example, to rotation 0. And there you go. To export these curves or to export these hair cards, you cannot just go into the modifier and apply it. The way you need to do it is kind of weird. Maybe they'll fix that in the future, but for now what you need to do is you need to grab a new object, you need to go into the geometry node settings, and you need to create a new geometry node system. Then you need to go in here and you need to grab the object node, and then you need to say, hey, I want to grab, you need to basically reference the curves object, so this one, and then you need to plug that basically into the geometry. Then you basically just copied what you had here over here. If you want to have it in the same spot, of course, you would have to bring the location back to 0, and then you can just go in here and apply it, and for some reason you now have the actual mesh right here. Of course, in this video I showed you how you can create hairstyles by fully just creating each individual hair strand, but you can of course also use geometry nodes to kind of take away a little bit of that work. And what I want to show you is just an example of how I, for example, created Phoenix from Valorant, and what kind of geometry node setup I have used, for example, for the dreadlocks. The way this works is basically I start here with I adjust the radius, of course, I change the thickness, I resample the curve so I have more resolution, and then I can duplicate the elements so that I basically duplicate the curve that I've created. If I, for example, mute this, you can see that's what the hair actually looks like. There are just a few kind of hair strands, and then I duplicate that 150 times, okay? That might be a little too much for some people. And then I can basically apply that to a noise texture, the W value, so that each individual duplication basically gets distorted or displaced in different directions by this noise texture using a set position node. This could also be a way to create the floating here for the hairstyle that we've created. If you want to see more complex setups, for example, for hair, or kind of go deeper into creating geometry node here, I could make another video about that. Just let me know, okay? People have asked if you can animate it or create dynamics for hair. You cannot simulate hair. That isn't really possible right now. Maybe when they add simulation nodes, maybe that works, but currently you cannot. But you can kind of make it a little wavy, add some sort of wind to the hair. The way you can do that is basically with the set position node, and then you grab the scene time node and plug that into the multiply so that you can basically animate it or let it animate just through the time of the scene. And then if you hit play, you can see it takes the seconds, it multiplies it by 2 and plugs that in the X value of the vector XYZ, plug that into the noise texture, and then you can create a little bit of a wavy animation to there. So if you want to animate your hair this way, you can do it like that. But you know, simulations are not possible yet. And last but not least, let's talk about optimization. If you want to make your render as fast as possible without losing a lot of detail or a lot of fidelity. First of all, of course, you can use, for example, the density brush to remove some of that density. You could, set it up in a way where it only removes, and then you can set the density and see how low you can make it without losing, for example, too much thickness in the hair. Of course, another thing you could try is just going into these different hair objects and then using the select random selection and then removing a few hairs, the random selection basically, trimming them away to see how much you can remove there until you reach a point where it basically looks good and you don't lose too much detail. Of course, you can also kind of mitigate the fact that you lose a little bit of volume and maybe you can see the skin underneath. You can kind of mitigate that by, for example, coloring the skin underneath the texture of the character basically darker so that it looks like there's more hair. Or you can also make the hair a little thicker. Of course, usually hair is very thin, so if the hair is a little thicker, it might kind of take away from the realism, but it maybe makes it a little bit easier to render. And then one more thing you could try, I'm not 100% sure if it works. You could maybe even in cycles use, instead of the principled hair BSDF, use the principled BSDF node. Maybe that works a little bit in your favor as well when it comes to performance. And maybe one more thing you can try is going to the curve settings and turning down the subdivision levels, not only in the viewport but even in the curves. Maybe that can help as well. If you have any more questions, of course, you can always post them in the comments. Thank you for watching. Maybe I'll see you next time. See ya.